Hello and welcome back to the Deep Dive. It is great to have you with us today.
Great to be here.
I want to start today's session with a question that might sound simple at first, but if you really sit with it, it gets a little uncomfortable.
Oh, I like those kinds of questions.
When you think about history, what actually comes to mind? Do you see a collection of static facts, like fossils buried in the ground just waiting to be dug up?
Date, battle, winner, loser, done.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or is history something else entirely? Is it something more fluid?
It's the fundamental question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Most of us are taught history in school as this series of names, dates, and fixed truths.
Yeah, you memorize them, you take the test, you move on.
But the material we're exploring today, it challenges that idea completely. We're looking at something called the Constructivist Paradigm.
The Constructivist Paradigm. Okay, I'll be honest, that sounds heavy. That sounds like something I'd read in a dusty library while wearing a tweed jacket.
It does sound a bit imposing, but the core idea is actually quite accessible.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, I think, crucial for understanding how we know what we know.
So what's the big idea?
This paradigm suggests that knowledge production, specifically historical knowledge, is not based on discovering fixed truths that are hiding out there.
Okay.
Instead, it's based on interpretation. It argues that historical reality is constructed. And the key phrase here, the one we're really going to unpack today, is that reality is constructed within a context.
Within a context. So that's our mission for this deep dive. We want to take that complex academic term, context, and really understand what it means. Because I have a feeling it's not as straightforward as just saying, oh, context just means the background info.
Exactly. It's so much more than background noise. And to really get this, we need to maintain a level of intellectual depth today. We want to be really precise with our language.
So let's get to the central ambiguity here. When these constructivist thinkers say reality is built with context, what are they actually talking about? Is it the context of the historical event itself, the year it happened, the weather, the wars going on, or are they talking about the mental context of the historian who is writing about it hundreds of years later?
That is the dilemma. That is the million-dollar question.
Right.
If I say context, am I pointing a finger at the past, or am I pointing it at the person holding the pen in the present?
I feel like in most casual conversations, when we say context, we mean the past. If I'm reading about Napoleon, I need the context of the French Revolution.
Of course.
I need to know what was happening in 18th century France.
That's the intuitive answer. That's where our brains go first. But here is where it gets fascinating. The constructivist paradigm places context at the very center of understanding, but it warns us that the concept is not one-dimensional.
Okay.
The answer to your question, is it the past or the present, is actually both.
Both. That feels like a bit of a cheat answer. It's everything.
I know, but hear me out. The phrase "with context" actually encompasses what we can call a two-way understanding of context. It's not one or the other.
So it's not a choice.
Right. It involves the reality of the past event, what actually happened back then, but it also involves the reality of the present writer.
Okay, let's unpack this. A two-way street. That makes sense in theory, but I want to break it down so we can really see how this works mechanically.
Good idea.
Let's start with the first dimension, the side of the street we're most familiar with. The literature calls this the objective historical context.
Right. Objective historical context. This is what we usually think of when we talk about history. This refers to the specific environment where the event actually took place.
So we're time traveling back to the event. What does the paradigm say we need to look for on this side of the equation? Is it just a list of dates?
Far from it. A list of dates tells you almost nothing about meaning. The constructivist view gives us a very specific checklist to understand the environment of the past. It says you cannot understand an event independently from its conditions.
Well, what kind of conditions?
You have to look at the political environment of that specific time. You have to look at the economic conditions.
Economics always plays a huge role. Follow the money, right?
Always. You can't understand a war if you don't understand the trade routes.
Oh.
But it goes deeper. You also have to consider the cultural norms and the religious structures of that era.
Okay.
And finally, the social relations.
So politics, economics, culture, religion, and social relations. It's like a web.
Precisely. It is a web. The argument here is that the meaning of an event is tied to that web. If you pull the event out of that web, out of that specific soil, and look at it in isolation, it loses its meaning.
Or worse.
Or worse, you project your own meaning onto it.
Can we make this concrete? The conceptual stuff is great, but I need an example. The research highlights a specific moment in history to illustrate this objective historical context. It talks about the translation movement during the Abbasid period.
Yes, this is a fantastic example because it's often misunderstood.
Right.
So let's set the scene. We're talking about the Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, roughly around the 8th to 10th centuries.
The golden age of Islam.
The golden age of Islam. This was the center of the world.
Right, Baghdad was the place to be.
It was a massive cosmopolitan metropolis. And during this time, there was this huge state-sponsored movement to translate Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic. Aristotle, Plato, Galen, Euclid, all of it.
Wow.
Now, if we ignore context, if we just look at the fact, we might just say, oh, the Abbasids liked books. They were intellectually curious. They translated a lot of stuff.
Right, they were just really into reading.
Yeah.
A nation of bookworms. But the constructivist lens says that's way too simple.
It's a surface-level reading.
So what's underneath?
To truly evaluate the Abbasid translation movement, we have to apply that checklist we just mentioned. We have to look at the intellectual atmosphere of that specific era. Why were they translating these specific books at the specific time?
And the research mentions religious debates, right?
Yes, this is crucial. There were intense religious and theological debates happening at the time. Debates between different Islamic schools of thought and debates with Christians and Jews living within the empire.
Ah.
The translators weren't just for fun, they were ammunition. They needed logic and philosophy to win arguments.
That puts a whole different spin on it. It wasn't just art for art's sake, it was functional.
And it gets even more political.
Yeah.
The paradigm points out another crucial factor, the search for political legitimacy.
Political legitimacy. How does translating a Greek book about geometry give you political legitimacy?
Well, think about the context. The Abbasids had just taken power. They ruled a massive, diverse empire with a huge non-Arab population, Persians, Greeks, Christians.
Yeah.
By translating the ancient wisdom of these cultures and integrating it into Arabic and Islamic culture, they were sending a message. They were saying, we are the heirs to all the world's knowledge. We are the rightful leaders of civilization.
Wow. So it's a power move.
It is absolutely a power move. It's soft power. And the literature also mentions the role of institutions. They built the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. This was a formal institution designed to centralize this knowledge transfer. So when you combine all that, the intellectual atmosphere, the religious debates, the political need for legitimacy, and the institutions, you get the objective historical context.
That makes the event so much richer. It's not just men translating books. It's a political, religious, and social project for the survival and expansion of an empire.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that is what the constructivists mean by that first dimension. You have to reconstruct that entire world to understand the event.
Okay. I am with you so far. That feels solid. We look at the past, we look at the environment, we understand the event. But you said this is a two-way understanding. We've only covered one way. We've only looked at the past.
This is where we shift gears. And honestly, this is where the constructivist paradigm really starts to challenge the traditional view of history. This is the part that might make some listeners a little uncomfortable.
I'm ready.
We have to talk about the second dimension. The literature calls this the subjective interpretive context.
Subjective interpretive context. Just hearing the word subjective in a discussion about history feels wrong.
I know.
We want history to be objective. We want facts.
We crave certainty, don't we?
Yeah, true.
But this dimension shifts the focus entirely. It views the historian or the researcher not as a neutral observer, but as an active part of the process.
I think this is a hard concept for some people to grasp. We like to think of historians as scientists in a lab coat. They look at the evidence, they measure it, and they report the results.
Right.
But this paradigm says, no, the historian is a human being with their own context.
Correct. The historian is not a camera taking a picture. A camera theoretically captures what is there. A historian is more like a painter making a painting.
Or a lawyer building a case.
A lawyer building a case. That's a good one. And the research details specifically how this influence happens. It mentions a few key factors. First, consider the specific sources they choose to select.
That's a big one. If you're writing about the Abbasids, there are thousands of documents. Why pick this one letter and not that one decree?
Precisely. Every choice is an exclusion of something else. And then consider the specific questions they choose to ask. The questions I ask about the Abbasids today, living in a modern, democratic, digital society, might be very different from the questions a historian asked in the 19th century under a colonial empire.
That's so true. A 19th century historian might ask about battles and kings. A modern historian might ask, what was life like for women? Or How did the economy affect the poor?
Exactly. The past didn't change. The questions changed. And finally, the research mentions how they make sense of or interpret the events.
So we have the selection of sources, the selection of questions, and then the interpretation. But why? Why does one historian interpret it one way and another interpret it differently? Is it just random?
It's not random. It's conditioned. The research gives us the root causes. It says the researcher is affected by their own time period. They are affected by their personal values.
Personal values. This is tricky. So if I value democracy, I might look at an ancient kingdom and judge it differently, maybe more harshly, than someone who values stability or order.
Absolutely. You cannot take your 21st century glasses off.
Yeah.
You view the world through them. And it's not just values, it's also their accumulated knowledge and even their personal interests.
What do you mean?
If a historian is fascinated by economics, they're going to tell an economic story. They will see trade routes where another historian sees religious pilgrimage. If they are fascinated by art, they will tell a cultural story.
So if I can play devil's advocate for a second, if the historian is so influenced by their own now, doesn't that mean history is just opinion? Doesn't this destroy the idea of truth?
That's the fear, right? That it all dissolves into relativity.
Yeah.
But the constructivist isn't saying there is no truth. They are saying truth is complex. History is not merely telling what happened in the past.
Okay.
Instead, history is a process of constructing meaning regarding the past. And this construction is done from the vantage point of the present, from today.
That is a powerful distinction, telling what happened versus constructing meaning. One sounds passive, like reading a ticker tape. The other sounds very active.
It is very active. It's a creative act. And that brings us back to that central ambiguity we started with. When the constructivist says, with context, they mean we have to look at the context of the Abbasids, yes.
Right.
But we also have to look at the context of the historian sitting in a library in 2026.
So we have these two dimensions, the objective historical, which is the past reality, and the subjective interpretive, the present mindset. How do they work together? Or are they fighting each other?
They are not fighting. They are interacting. This is the synthesis. The conclusion of our discussion today and the core of the constructivist argument is that historical knowledge is produced through the interaction of these two contexts.
Interaction, it's like a dialogue.
Exactly. Think of it as a conversation. On one side, you have the Abbasid structures, the economy, the political legitimacy, the house of wisdom. That voice is coming from the past. It has weight. It has reality.
That side.
On the other side, you have the now, the historian's values, their curiosity, their modern perspective.
And the history book, the final product, is the transcript of that conversation.
That is a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
You cannot have the conversation with just one person. If you only have the past facts without the historian's interpretation, you just have a pile of data.
It's meaningless.
It has no meaning. It's just a dusty list. But if you only have the historian's viewpoint without the facts of the past, you have fiction. You have a novel. You need both to create historical knowledge.
This really changes how you read a history book, doesn't it? You are not just learning about the subject, you are learning about the author, too.
You are.
You're watching someone from the 21st century try to speak to someone from the 8th century.
You are. And that is what makes this paradigm so useful for critical thinking. When you read about the past, you should always be asking two sets of questions. First, what was the environment back then? What were the politics and economics?
And second,
who is telling me this story? What is their environment right now? Why are they telling this version of the story?
it really connects the dots between the past and the present. It stops history from being this dead, distant thing under glass.
It makes history alive.
Yeah.
It means history is constantly being rewritten. Not because the past changes, the basic period is over, it is done, the ink is dry on their scrolls, but because we change. Our subjective context changes.
Oh.
So the questions we ask change, and therefore the history we construct changes.
That explains why we see new books about the same topics every 10 or 20 years. Why do we need another biography of Lincoln? Or another history of Rome? The facts haven't changed.
The facts haven't changed, but we have. We have new questions, we have new anxieties. We look at Rome to understand our own decline or our own empire or our own democracy. The mirror changes.
Man, that is deep. Well, we have covered a lot of ground today, and I want to make sure this sticks. Let's try to recap the main points for our listeners.
Let's do it.
We started with the Constructivist Paradigm.
Right. The idea that history is not a collection of fixed truths waiting to be found, but a knowledge produced through interpretation.
And we focused on the two-way understanding of context.
Yes. Dimension one. The objective historical context. This is the political, economic, and social reality of the event itself.
Like how the political need for legitimacy drove the Abbasid translation movement.
Exactly, and dimension 2.
The subjective interpretive context. This is the now. The historian's mental context. Their values, their time period, and the specific questions they decide to ask based on who they are.
And the final takeaway.
That historical knowledge is the product of the interaction between these two contexts. It is a construction built by the present, using the materials of the past.
You've got it.
It is really a brilliant way to frame it. It empowers the learner, I think. It reminds us that when we learn history, we are engaging in a process of understanding, not just memorization.
Right. It invites you to be part of the conversation.
Absolutely. And for our listeners, whether you are an academic or just someone who loves a good story, this is a great tool. When you read a text, look for the author's context. Look for the why behind the what.
Don't just consume the narrative. Interrogate it.
This has been such an enlightening discussion. I love those moments where a dry academic term like context suddenly opens up a whole new way of seeing the world. It's like putting on a new pair of glasses.
It is the joy of deep dives. There's always more beneath the surface.
Before we sign off, I want to leave you, our listener, with a final thought to mull over. We have talked about how the historian's modern context shapes the history they write.
Yes.
So if history is a construction built by the interaction of the event's reality and the historian's mindset, here is the question. How much of what we consider history is actually a reflection of us and our current times, rather than the past itself? When we gaze back at the Abbasids or the Romans or the Tudors, are we looking through a clear window at the past, or are we, at least partially, staring into a mirror?
That is a very provocative thought. It suggests that every history book is, in a strange way, a book about the present.
Something to think about until next time. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Thank you. Keep questioning.